With that, I would like to get started with the panel. I'd like to welcome all of the panelists up to the stage. If you guys want to all join me. Our first speaker is Dr. Marc Kirschner from Harvard Medical School, where he is the John Franklin Enders University Professor of Systems Biology and the founding chair of Systems Biology. Dr. Kirschner began his journey on the West Coast, getting a PhD at the University of California, Berkeley, and headed to the East Coast to begin his first faculty position at Princeton University, leading to his arrival at Harvard in the early 90s. Dr. Kirschner's lab focuses on the understanding of complex signaling that is involved in the development of complex organisms. Today he will speak to the reimagining the endless frontier.
Okay, well, thanks very much. Thank you for all of you, all the students and postdocs who banded together and with this considerable effort in putting a meeting such as this on. And I think, you know, we're all very busy in life. We all have goals and aspirations and pressures, but I think it's very important to take some time out to do something for the community and do something which in the end will benefit you as well. And I think this is particularly obvious for young people because it's their future, their own future, which lies at risk here. Now, Henry Bourne told me that his main point was that the revolution has to start from the bottom. And I think it's important to realize that the senior scientists, whether they're the problem or not, they're certainly not masters of the universe here, that they really have to, we have to all work together to try to create circumstances for change. It does remind me a little bit of the 1960s and early 70s when I sort of grew up and maybe my own political sensitivities were formed. And the only thing I see is lacking. I mean, we still have the same pressures and needs and questions throughout our society, and also particularly within the scientific society. What I see is missing is we don't have any good science folk songs. So I think we need to work on that aspect if we're going to get our movement together. Now, I'm one of the gang of four who wrote this PNAS document, which I understand many of you have read. It demonstrated, of course, that this is a very systemic problem, and we proposed some remedies there. And I should say we were driven to propose some remedies, not by our belief that we had the answers, but because without proposing anything, it just sounded like whining. So it put the obligation on anybody else who was going to whine back to actually propose their own remedies. And so I think one has to be thinking about practical terms. That said, for my few minutes this morning, I don't want to think in practical terms. I want to think in more idealistic terms. I want to try to understand what some of the principles are which have guided successful, productive, innovative, transformative scientific investigation for the last several hundred years. I think these principles are enduring. They're probably, in my mind, were first formulated by Francis Bacon, who was born in the end of the 16th century. He's sort of the father of inductive reasoning, empiricism, and he championed that our ideas have to come from our experience, and we put them together. They were not being handed down to us from some sort of policy or document or a belief system. And I think that's a good way to begin, and to try to figure out what are the principles on which we would base any change that we would advocate. So I'm going to argue that there are several of these which are kind of universal, and they're based on the experience of the entire scientific community and society, and they're not very obscure either. But they, however, are being qualified, challenged, and limited by all sorts of behaviors, by our economic behaviors, by our lack of planning. And I think we can look at anything we do and test them against these principles. The reason I'm so concerned about that is because this is an extremely adaptive system in the scientific community. And when you want to make one change, you're never quite sure how it's going to ultimately turn out. One example of that was the reform of the NIH study sections, which said more emphasis should be placed on impact and significance. And that seemed reasonable to me at the time. But that actually was interpreted by everyone to mean that more emphasis should be placed on the project itself and not the individual. And that's just one of the problems, because if you're looking about, well, what is the impact of this piece of work, which is in fact impossible to determine, except in retrospect. And that was about the work, not what was the chance that this person doing this kind of work would actually do something useful. And so I say nobody was thinking about that, and that's why we have to say this about any of the proposals we make. How will these be modified by the system we have, and also by self-interested parties who feel that reform should come somewhere else? You know, the person next door should pay more taxes, not you, that sort of thing. Okay, so let me just quickly give you a few of the principles. I think science proceeds in an environment of free inquiry, and that means we need heretics. And we don't have a system that encourages iconoclasts, and yet we have all these people in our background: Mendel, Marie Curie, Banting and Best, Barbara McClintock, more recently Mello and Fire, who made their great contributions by going against the current trend. Now, this is a problem because some of the people who have heretical ideas are just plain nuts, and we don't have an infinite amount of money to fund them. But it really means that we have to bend over backwards to encourage people who have new ideas, people entering new fields. And that's also true for young people, because they come to the system. They have the advantage of youth. You can't blame them for not being older. But at the same time, you know, they don't have the experience, they don't have the training, all this sort of stuff, which I think is nonsense, frankly. I think people can move from one area to another. They can talk to people who know how to do the techniques they don't need to know. So I think we just have to be able, as we look at things, and we look at new ideas, at new approaches, we have to really support that. And even though we obviously have to have a threshold where we say this is just, you know, too far out and we're not going to support it, but we work hard for that. And that comes true when, for also papers that get published, and we read things that we don't totally think are right, but we can't figure out what's wrong. We don't want to reject those papers because they can be reviewed later publicly by the after publication. I think the post-publication review is a lot more important than the pre-publication review. Now, it turns out Einstein's papers weren't even reviewed at all. The editor just said, seems interesting, we'll publish them. Later, he said in a paper that got reviewed, he was furious that somebody would actually send it out to somebody else to review it. But we've carried that to an extreme. Second major point, beyond the free inquiry thing, and really to encourage that rather than discourage it, is that science progresses most rapidly when scientists can devote the majority of their energies on science. Now, this seems obvious, but and we should remember how much was accomplished in aristocratic science. Darwin married a wealthy woman and never worked a day in his life, and look at how much he accomplished. So, and you could argue that the mid-20th century academics, while not having the exact benefits that Darwin had, they had a pretty cushy life. They could think and travel, and grants were almost automatic, and that was pretty easy. I don't think that was so terrible. In fact, I think that, in fact, under the highly pressured, highly competitive system we have now, people are not as creative, or it's much more difficult to be creative. I know there are people in the world of economics who believe that competition assures the greatest benefit in the outcome, but I don't think you can argue that for science. I think you need to have time for things that are more difficult. Time to teach, time to talk to a colleague, time to talk to somebody else's graduate students. And then, of course, there's all this immense number of federal and local regulations, which are well-meaning, but which subtract what little time we have. And then, of course, we write grants all the time. Now, writing a grant can be a creative exercise, and writing a paper can be a creative exercise. But rewriting the grant and rewriting the paper, that's not such a creative exercise. And there's a price to be paid for that. Okay, so I think we should recognize that science proceeds best in the context of lively and self-organizing communities. That is, groups, departments, schools, where people come together, where they have the resources to do something, where they can recognize somebody who is doing something original and encourage them, maybe even fund them if they don't have the money, and where there's socialization going on. Much better than the ethics courses that are being shoved down our throats are to see people who, by their example, are acting ethically. And high achievement, I think, is encouraged. I started out as a graduate student at Rockefeller. I didn't last there, but I stayed there for a little bit. But I first encountered a scientist there who hadn't published a paper in 10 years. And he was working on solid-phase peptide synthesis. And a few years thereafter, he won the Nobel Prize for that work. He was working out the technique. Some things take a while. And so we need communities for that, and we base assessment on people by how far away they are from us, not by how close they are to us. And that's very hard to judge, except by metrics. The other thing I wanted to stress, we have to remember, is that effective communities are built from many types of contributors. Now, we tend to honor greatly the people who did the original great breakthrough work, the discovery of something. But those discoveries were not made in a vacuum. Those discoveries were made by other people who opened the questions to begin with, who did the preliminary work. They were taught by people who inspired these people. And if we tend to a system that's so hyper-competitive and so based on measurable output by publication in elite journals, we're going to destroy this community, which is in fact going to destroy a lot of the creativity. So we have to have a way of valuing people who are in fact just helpful and useful and thoughtful, and maybe don't publish as many papers as other people publish. Now, the next principle is that communication is the lifeblood of science. And the publishing system for everyone, not just for young faculty, but for older faculty, and not just for people who are just struggling, but people who are in fact quite comfortable, is an increasingly painful process. And we're producing an immense amount of work for supplemental information. The students are being taught courses on how to detect bad science, and so they look at papers as if they were detectives looking for traces of error. Nobody's being taught how to detect good science. And now there are a lot of complaints about editors and journals, but the main problem is the scientific community. It's like Pogo said in the cartoon, we've met the enemy and he is us. I mean, we are the ones, we're the reviewers, we're the people really supporting the system. I'm not saying others don't have some responsibility, but this is something we should try to change. Okay, there's just two more things that strike me as very important. One is that science is unpredictable. We should remember this, that this has led to a discouragement of people working in descriptive studies. again, going back to Darwin, the voyage of the Beagle was not just a fishing expedition. I mean, but yet he had to observe things before he could theorize about them. When Sidney Brenner started working on the worm, he had a lot of ideas about why it would be a useful organism, but basically he wanted to explore a lot of things that had been explored in other systems in a different system. And we have to anticipate that that some of our greatest discoveries were made in rather obscure areas. I think maybe my favorite one is the discovery of restriction enzymes, an obscure mechanism of immunity in bacteria by Werner Arber and Ham Smith. And this was completely responsible, still responsible, for the recombinant DNA revolution. And these people themselves couldn't anticipate the significance of their findings, let alone grant reviewers. If at this time, it wouldn't have had a chance. And there are many, many, many such examples. And the final thing is that I feel trying to draw a line between basic and translational research is a fool's errand. In 1976, unfortunately it's been a long time, Julius Comroe at UCSF tried to trace the developments of the major improvements in cardiac care and traced the vast majority of them to work that was done not even in basic science on the heart, but in other systems and other questions, other problems. And this is the rule, not the exception, the way progress occurs. So in my view, translational science in the past was something like building better respirators for polio victims, while basic science was learning how to grow and understand the polio virus. And I think we need to be really focused even more on basic science. When Vannevar Bush wrote his famous statement about the endless frontier, it was all about basic science. He pointed out that the military advances that were made by science during the war, which were considerable, you know, the atomic bomb, radar, proximity fuse, these things, were all made by people coming from outside the military. He saw the military as the enemy. And I think we're really in the same state right now. A lot of people banishing about translational science, the scientific community getting very excited about it because they think maybe it's the pathway for funding. I think we should be very careful by overemphasizing that route. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kirschner. So I failed to mention quite how this is going to work. Everyone will have an opportunity to ask questions. We're going to go through each of the panelists. Each one's going to give a 10-minute talk, and then there's a microphone affixed in the middle, and people can line up and give questions. And I'll talk more about the question process when we get there. And so without further ado, our next speaker is Michael Teitelbaum, who is currently a senior research associate at the Labor and Work Life program at Harvard Law School. Michael Teitelbaum was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University, where he held prestigious positions, followed by prestigious positions at Princeton University and Oxford University. Currently, among many things, he studies the trends in science and engineering labor markets in the US and elsewhere. He recently published a book entitled Falling Behind, Boom and Bust of the Global Race for Scientific Talent. Today, Michael Teitelbaum will speak about responding constructively to symptoms of malice.
I was just giving a talk a couple of weeks ago at the National Cancer Institute, and they have a pointer that had the mysterious property of working on the wall, but disappearing when it got to the slide. I never did figure that out. That's why I checked to see if this would work. Well, I just want to start by congratulating the volunteers who've organized this symposium. It's a lot of work, and they've got other things to do that are very pressing. But it's a very positive thing to have a metropolitan area-wide kind of symposium about these issues. The National Postdoctoral Association, I know, came out of a meeting like this in 2000 2002 or something like that. It was held in Washington, where the presidents of 5 campus-based postdoc associations who had never met each other for the first time and came up with this crazy idea of having a national postdoctoral association. And I spent a lot of my career in New York City, and I believe there is a metropolitan New York City postdoc consortium among the various research institutions in New York City and its immediate area, which is quite useful. But I think there are many more postdocs in the Boston metropolitan area than there are in New York. So you might want to think about whether there's enough common interest among the institutions and the postdocs at them to have some kind of citywide activities. And in any way, I just want to compliment the group who put this together. What I want to talk about, by the way, the book that was mentioned is there, just so you see what it looks like. What I want to talk about is arguments about whether the U.S. is falling behind and we need to have many more people going into science and mathematics and engineering. And there are certainly influential people who think so. I put up these quotes for you, the first from President Obama, and you see that he's actually invoking the Sputnik period, which is one of the great stimuli of enormous investments in science, mathematics, and engineering, which had the misfortune of producing the Apollo program, which unfortunately for science and mathematics was a spectacular success. And that led to a plummeting of interest in the political system, in the enormous amount of money that was being put into the Apollo program once it was so successful. And then there was a big bust in the 1970s after the successful landing on the moon and return in 1969. These 2 reports in 2005, I think, were very influential. The one on the left, Tapping America's Potential, I don't know if you can read the auspices, but it's 15 major business associations led by the Business Roundtable, including the National Association of Manufacturers, the Semiconductor Industry Association, the Council on Competitiveness, and so on. What was nice about this report was they put their goal right on the cover: double the number of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics graduates by 2015. And that was published in 2005. So they were saying we need a 100% increase in the number of people graduating in these fields from college within a 10-year period. It hasn't happened, but that was their goal. And it's nice that they put the goal right on the cover, I thought. This you've probably seen, the Rising Above the Gathering Storm report, very influential report, probably the most influential report in decades coming out of the National Academy complex, and making similar kinds of arguments that the U.S. is falling behind and needs to rise above the gathering storm. Very evocative title. Now, these are not new arguments. In my research on this book, I discovered that there were actually 5 rounds of alarms like those, followed by booms in the number of scientists and engineers being produced or funding for science and engineering. Usually it was the government that produced the boom, and then busts at the end. So you had 10 or 15 year-long cycles that I call alarm, boom, bust cycles. I'm not going to go through these in any detail because of the timing, but you can see that round 2 was that post-Sputnik cycle. And it did end in a bust, unfortunately. So the question is, where are we now? Are these things still happening? We may be in the middle of round 6 since World War II, but we don't know. We'll never know that until we look back from maybe 5 or 10 years forward and say, oh yeah, that was an alarm, boom, bust cycle. You can't tell when you're in the middle of a cycle. But the truth is the U.S. is not falling behind in basic science, despite the alarming reports that you've no doubt seen. It is the leader in basic science research. It still is the leader. It became the leader after World War II, and partly it was because its competitors were devastated by World War II. But it was also, Dr. Kirschner mentioned the Science, the Endless Frontier, Vannevar Bush report. If you haven't read that report, it's good bedside reading. It's a beautifully written, very articulate, very well-reasoned report to the president that was quite influential in 1945 and subsequent years. It is the origin of the system that you are all part of today, in which he basically said that the federal government really should step up and start supporting basic research, which it hadn't really been doing. But it should not just set up a bunch of government research labs and finance them. It should make grants, a novel idea, make research grants for basic research to universities. And of course, the rest is history, and you have a very large federal grant system from multiple sources in the government going to university labs to support basic research. And the truth is that the amount of funding that has evolved over time is very large. Almost half of the total research funding by all OECD countries is US government funding. And it's about 1% of the GDP, which is more than any large country. If you get into small countries, you can get obviously above 1% without having a large amount of money involved. But of the large countries, it is more than any other country. I would, in my judgment, the US is still predominant in basic research, and it's strengthening. It's not declining. But others are closing the gap. They're catching up, particularly those that fell behind, literally, in the 50s and 60s because of the consequences of the war. It's less true of Asia, where R&D is more heavily in applied research and in development than in basic research. The problem is we have an unstable system, and those of you who were here yesterday will have heard that from a couple of the speakers. And postdocs are what the military calls collateral damage. They're not targeted by anybody, but they bear the brunt of the instability in the system. We've got positive feedback in the system. It was not really designed to be this way, but it turned out to be a positive feedback system, and it hasn't been corrected. And the main reason is that PhDs and postdocs are the primary research workforce under federal research grants. So if you raise the budget for federal research, you will produce slots for more PhD students and funded slots for more PhD students and postdocs. I put up some numbers here just to give you a sense of this. NSF, 86%, they support 44,000 graduate students in the US. 86% of them are funded under research grants. So all of us know and admire the Graduate Research Fellowship Program of the NSF. It's a very impressive program. Very high quality people. Some of you may have been in that category or are in that category. But it's small compared to the number of people supported under research grants. NIH, the comparable number, which includes postdocs, is 78%. So it's an odd system because the demand for RAs is determined not by a sense of how many PhDs and very highly skilled, educated people are needed to do the basic research enterprise. It's based upon the demand for RAs in the universities to fulfill the terms of the research grants. And prospective postdocs and PhDs, some of you may tell me I'm wrong, I'd be interested in hearing this, but those I have talked to, and there are a lot of them, have told me they got very little information really as they began to contemplate doing a PhD or a postdoc. Many said they were naive about career prospects. They didn't know that academic tenure track positions are an alternative career for PhDs. They're not the primary career path. And this is not the case in the same universities that have business schools and law schools and medical schools. They provide lots of data to prospective students about what the career paths of their graduates have been. But when it comes to science, with some exceptions, which are, it's changing now, but generally speaking, it's hard to get that information. What you typically will see is, well, our PhDs get very good postdocs, but not what they do 5 to 10 years after their PhD. So isn't there a negative feedback system that would stabilize? Because positive feedback, for those of you who are systems biologists or engineers, you know that positive feedback is usually destabilizing kind of feedback. Aren't there negative feedbacks? And the answer is yes, there are negative feedback loops here. And in particular, talented US students can just opt out and say, well, I'm not going to do that because it's not attractive. So if it were a domestic system and if it wasn't an attractive pathway to a career, the system would adjust, what economists call adjust. Fewer of those students would go into these fields. The universities would have to make it more attractive in some ways to go into these career paths, or they'd have to change the way they do research and who does the research. But it's not a domestic system. It's increasingly a global system with this unplanned, what I call an unplanned policy confluence between visas and funding. So you have a visa system where there are no limits on students, international students and postdocs. And you have a funding system in which international students and postdocs can be funded under research grants, but oddly enough, not funded under fellowship and training grants. So that's the way the system is structured. Nobody really planned it that way. I'm sure there was never a discussion about how these two things would interact with each other. But the outcome is that if you believe any of the data about postdocs, and frankly I don't, because I know how they're collected, but if you believe any of the data, it looks as if over half of biomedical postdocs now are international postdocs. I don't think anybody ever thought of that 20 years ago. It's risen very rapidly over the last 20 years. But the postdocs are not the core problem. This is a system problem, as other speakers have said. And there are other sources of instability as well. There's positive feedback regarding research. So if you have more research dollars available, it begets or produces more research proposals, which means there has to be more peer review, which means that success rates, even if the funding is going up, success rates often go down. And you end up with a kind of cycle of frustration because people have to rewrite their proposals and there's more review that has to be done and people apply for more grants because they know the success rates are going down, and you have a kind of negative spiral, if you will, in this system. There are also incentives that favor expansion on the part of universities. They've already been mentioned, so I won't go through them, but there are all kinds of incentives that nobody really intended to work out the way they've worked out. By one calculation done here actually in Boston, David Korn, who was at Harvard and still is in Boston, and his colleagues, they did some simulations in 2002. It's an interesting article to read in Science. I put the reference up there. Very prescient article because what they were asking is what's going to happen when the doubling is finished. And their conclusion was that the NIH ecosystem, which includes all of the universities and other grantees and contractees of NIH, was structured in such a way that it requires 6% annual budget increase for NIH to be stable. If it went below 6% under their simulations, it was not stable anymore. And they didn't go below 4%, plus 4%, because they said that would be a disaster if it went below 4%. Well, it did go below 4%. As you know, after the doubling, it went to 0%, and it's been relatively flat, and depending on your inflation adjustments, it's gone down by some significant amount. I'll show you a graph in a moment. And then you have incompatible time frames, too, because basic research, all of you do basic research, and you know it's a very long-term proposition, multiple years of needed in a serious research program, but the appropriations from the federal government are annual propositions, and they accelerate and decelerate, and it's acceleration and deceleration in this kind of system is very destabilizing. It'll generate oscillation, instability, and these booms and busts. So if any of you are engineers in the audience, you might want to model this system as let's say, an electronic circuit, and I think you'd find it would be screeching, it'd be oscillating in very negative ways, in ways that you wouldn't want to listen to. Here's the NIH budget from 1960 to 2012. The dark line is the current dollars, not adjusted for inflation. And the two above it are constant dollars adjusted for inflation according to two different inflating measures. You can see that it stayed ahead of inflation right through this period. And then you can see bracketed here, that rectangle is the 5-year doubling period for the NIH budget, in which the budget didn't quite go vertical, but that's a pretty steep curve upward. And then you can see it's been essentially flat with some blips in it in current dollars. And in constant dollars, adjusted for inflation, it's come down pretty substantially. Okay, so the general picture you got from that was very substantial increases in funding for NIH over the long term, with recent years being flat or declining in real terms. This is a long-term graph showing the success rate of R01 equivalent competing applications from, what does it say, 1962 to I'm looking at the 2013, I guess, or 2012. And I think what's relevant here is that's the success rate. And you can see that it fluctuates around, but basically it's a declining success rate. So back in the 60s, when perhaps some of your mentors were submitting proposals, the success rate was 60%, looks like, right? And now it's below 20%. You can see that the success rate went up a bit during the doubling period and then went down again. And it's now lower than it was before the budget doubled. This is incomprehensible to members of Congress when you tell them that the success rates are terrible and destructive and damaging. They say, wait a second, didn't we just double the budget? You're telling me that we doubled the budget and now you're in poverty? We doubled the budget in 5 years and now it's a terrible situation? How can that possibly be? I've had those conversations with members of Congress, and it's not pleasant because they're saying, how greedy can you be? Nobody else's budget got doubled. Only NIH's budget got doubled, and you're saying that you're now being stressed terribly by inadequate funding. So you can see what happened here, I think. I mean, it's not stable, but you can see that the number of proposals went up and down. After you got the doubling in train, the number of proposals went sharply up. Again, not straight line, but generally up. And that meant the success rates went down. So what I want to leave with you is acceleration and deceleration in funding like this causes real harms. It's not just an erratic curve on a graph. For students, graduate students and postdocs too, their prospects, their career prospects can wane while they're still studying. They can look very promising when they start and look very bad by the time they finish, because these are multi-year commitments on their parts. For research faculty, accomplished research faculty can experience sort of random disruption of their research programs by non-renewal or of a grant or the lack of success of a new grant, and their careers can be disrupted also. And for universities, who have leveraged up in many cases because of the rising funding available, particularly medical schools, They've maximized the amount of soft funding from grants for faculty salaries, including tenure faculty salaries, and they've raised the debt, the money they borrowed to build facilities and remodel laboratories, on the assumption that the budgets would continue their rise, their historical rise that you saw earlier, and they haven't continued that rise. They've also expanded the number of PhD students and expanded the number of postdocs as their workforce. So the problem that results is if the assumed growth in the budget lags behind the assumption or doesn't occur, they suddenly find themselves in financial crises, and it's especially true in biomedical fields. I'm just showing you an article I wrote about this in 2008 in Science magazine, in which I hoped I was going to be wrong. I really hoped what I said would turn out to be wrong, and I would happily say, well, I got that wrong, and I'm sorry to say I didn't get it wrong. It was saying the system is unstable and it really requires continuous funding, and if that doesn't continue, it's going to be in serious trouble. So how can it be that higher education can under and overproduce at the same time? It does underproduce in some fields. For example, associate degrees in many technical fields, I believe, are underproduced relative to employer demand. Quality master's degrees aimed at non-academic careers are underproduced, and maybe engineering bachelor's degrees are underproduced, at least in the US. It's only about 4% of all bachelor's degrees are in engineering in the US. Now, when I say nota bene here, employers who claim shortages of scientists and engineers are often talking about these categories. They can't find engineers, they can't find technicians to work in their labs or in their development efforts. Meanwhile, the system is overproducing, and you heard that yesterday, in some fields, and probably, especially biomedical PhDs and postdocs exceed workforce demand. Now, I'm saying that I want to reflect what counter-arguments might be, because there are counter-arguments to what I've just said. One of them is, well, we really can't have too many highly educated scientists and engineers. How can you have too many of a good thing? And these are highly skilled people. These are human capital. The more human capital you have, the better your economy will perform, the better goods will be produced for the world, and so on. And they are human capital, and if they can't find a career in what they've studied for, they will find their own way, some other direction, and they will be creative and brilliant, and they will innovate. And they will strengthen other occupations outside of science and engineering, even if they can't find a career in science and engineering. Those would be counter-arguments to what I said earlier. So why are there these disconnects? Well, the first is that higher education has pretty weak feedback from the labor market, as you've probably discovered if you've been in universities. It's relatively isolated from the broad labor markets, and it's got these big long lags built into it. So even if the system appreciates and incorporates the fact that things aren't going so well for graduates in certain fields in recent years, it's got this, there are already students who have entered into these programs and are working in their 4th year or their 5th year, and so you've got these big long lags built in. The other reason is that it's subsidized, and subsidies tend to distort the way systems respond to external forces. So you've got loans, you've got student loans, you've got state support for research universities, you've got tax exemptions, and you've got the research grants programs that I've already talked about. And universities can finance PhDs from research grants, as you've already seen, but they can't finance master's degrees in science, typically from research grants. So it's mostly personally financed. So one is subsidized, the other isn't. If one level is subsidized, the other isn't. Associate's degrees are subsidized in community colleges, mostly state and local funding, but it's been waning in recent years. And engineering bachelor's degrees are usually personally financed, although they're subsidized at public institutions But at the public institutions, the fees have been rising the most rapidly because of the pulling back of state support. So I just want to end by saying you will have heard many stories of there being general shortages of scientists and engineers in the U.S. I would say it's the standard position of the U.S. media and political system. It's misleading to say that, in my view. There are variations across these fields. There are variations across time. A lot of the complaints come from Silicon Valley and places like that. We live part of the year in San Francisco, and let me tell you, it is not typical what's going on in Silicon Valley and San Francisco. These are hothouses. They have extraordinarily high housing costs. It's very difficult to attract an engineer or a scientist from Provo, Utah to the Bay Area because that person will discover that that the housing is 4 times as expensive in the Bay Area, or 3 times maybe, as it is in Provo. So these are atypical places, and they're also subject to big booms and busts with high frequency and high amplitude. So generalizations coming from Silicon Valley or similar hothouses should be viewed skeptically, and you should look at the national data to see what's actually happening. And yet those STEM shortages that you keep hearing about, they prevail. And why is that? In my view, I will tell you why, very simply. There's been a lot of money spent to lobby in support of the existence of these serious STEM shortages. It's led by information technology employers and by the immigration bar, and the goal is to increase the number of visas for people with these skills. There's some support from higher education and government, but it's really led by the employers. And then it's picked up by the non-specialist media who don't really know the subject, and all these prominent companies are saying they can't hire the people they need, and they believe it. But the main reason then is that it works. The claims work politically. So if you did a survey in the Congress, you'd find that most members of Congress believe there are serious science and engineering shortages in the U.S. workforce. And those who question that are far weaker. I mean, they're academic researchers, they're RAND analysts. People like that can just be ignored easily by the political system and are. Science and engineering societies that disagree are really unable to counter the tens of millions of dollars, literally, that goes into lobbying from employers. And the result is it's really no contest. The shortage claims prevail. So where are we now? I'd say somewhere midpoint in the 6th round, maybe. We don't know. There's pressure on the U.S. government to address these shortages. There are 2 ways to do it. You could increase funds for R&D and for science and engineering education, but that's difficult given the budget situation. Or you can increase the visas. That's what the companies are demanding. There's no budget limit on these visas. And there's a chance that President Obama will do that, actually, by executive order after the election, as he put it, as part of his promised executive actions on immigration. So if the U.S. government does stimulate a boom in the supply of scientists and engineers, will a bust ensue 5, 7 years down the road? I don't know. That's why I say stay tuned, but it's possible. Promising things that are happening. First, the advisory committee to the director had this biomedical, I think maybe this one is dying. Oh, there we are. You should read this if you haven't read it. It's a very good effort by a very high-quality group of people, advisory to Francis Collins at NIH. And then you've just heard from Marc Kirschner, who is one of the, he said gang of 4. I thought the term was the quartet. But whichever you want to call it, this is a very distinguished group of 4 biomedical researchers and leading administrators who are raising these issues in a very constructive way, and that's a promising sign. It's going to be harder for your PIs, your mentors, to ignore if it's coming from people like Marc Kirschner and Bruce Alberts, Shirley Tillman, and Harold Varmus. Some possible stabilizers, and that's my last slide. So what might you do to stabilize this system? One, well, for the graduate and postdoc systems, align them better with career prospects, and align them less with research funding. For research institutions and faculty, change those incentives I talked about that encourage institutions to leverage up with borrowed money or soft money, and maybe allocate an additional overhead. This is a novel idea, I think, that comes from Richard Freeman at Harvard, to NIH provide a small allowance additional in the overhead that would go into a fund for bridge funding for faculty whose grants don't get renewed. Right now, the universities are funding it out of their own resources, but with an unstable system, bridge funding would be useful. And then finally, steadier growth. A 5-year budget plan, such as proposed by Marc and his colleagues in the quartet, or the Gang of Four, is a very interesting idea, which would be very constructive for this system. And I am finished.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much. So we're going to move right along. We asked that the other speakers try to keep the time to as close to the 10-minute mark as possible so that we have time for questions. We next welcome to our biomedical workforce panel, Naomi Rosenberg. Dr. Rosenberg is the Dean of the Sackler School of Graduate and Biomedical Sciences at Tufts University and the Vice Dean for Research and Professor of Pathology at Tufts University School of Medicine. Dr. Rosenberg is actively involved in developing education and training programs to prepare the next generation of highly educated biomedical scientists and was recently elected as the chair of graduate education and research training for the group for the American Association of Medical Colleges. In addition, Dr. Rosenberg was part of the advisory committee to the NIH Director Working Group for Future Biomedical Workforce, and today she'll be speaking about the future scientific workforce, positive approaches, and a time for change.
So thank you for having me. As indicated, I guess, by the title of my talk, I think you've heard a great deal, and actually you probably knew a great deal even before you heard it, about the seriousness of the situation that research is facing, that each of you are facing in determining your direction, and those that are training along with you, or our students, and actually the faculty who are participating in your training face. I want to approach this from as optimistic a perspective as possible. I feel as though we need tremendous energy to begin to address these problems and fix them. And I cannot understand how we can fix them if we cannot engender some optimism in the future. I'm not talking at all about being a Pollyanna. There are some people in the audience that know me, and I would be really surprised if they described me as a Pollyanna. However, I think that we all need to approach this from the perspective that we face huge challenges and we need to rise to try to meet them, even though they're difficult. Larry Bacow, who some of you may know, used to be the president of Tufts University, my university, was very fond of saying that races are run on the uphill, meaning that we really sometimes are challenged to do our best work when times are very difficult. And certainly, I think the time that we face as we consider the future of research, research training, and the future of the workforce calls on us in that very analogy. Why would I be optimistic at a time like this? Because I'm not sure you heard much optimism from Marc or Michael, and I don't really know if you'll hear any from Cynthia. Well, first of all, I would say that when we look at the data, and granted it's just data from my institution, of what happens to our students and our postdocs, we do find that most of them remain in science. And I'm not talking about students simply transferring on to a postdoc and then having no sense of where they go after that. We do actually know where they go after that. And the majority of them remain engaged in some way in science beyond the postdoc. No, our students aren't different than the ones you've heard about and know about. They're not all academic scientists. Many of them are in industry, some of them are in science policy, some of them are in business development related to science. They're pursuing a range of careers. They may not be the careers they started out to pursue, but they are the careers that they are pursuing, and judging by the fact that they seem to be advancing in these careers, I'm assuming that they're successful. Or at least many of them are. And from surveys that we have done, although no survey is perfect, we certainly know that many of them feel a sense of satisfaction in what they're doing and what they're accomplishing. To me, this is a bright spot. And I would suggest that for many of you, you will experience similar bright spots no matter what path your career takes. Do we have issues? What about faculty? Certainly they're under tremendous stress. Many of the speakers have touched on this and touched on the perils of the funding environment. I think thinking hard about the sort of boom-bust cycles that Michael just talked about is really important. I would say that somehow often forgotten in our discussions of the workforce and the increase in students and postdocs driven by the increase in science budgets, we must remember that many faculty certainly value their role as mentors and trainers of students and postdocs. That said, do we have faculty who don't place value on some of the careers that you may be aspiring to or others aspire to as they go through their training? Absolutely. There are those people out there. I'm sure you all know some of them. I certainly know some of them. I would say it's our responsibility, people here in the front, you out there, to work as hard as we can to change that perception and actually educate faculty to the situation that we face and that they should embrace as they mentor their trainees. I'm optimistic because I was invited here by you today, not because you invited me personally, but because you put a tremendous amount of effort into putting together this program and stimulating a very important dialogue. This is a dialogue that is ongoing. Certainly you read a number of papers. There are other papers that you could read about it. People are starting to pay attention. Problem's not fixed yet, and certainly the problem of funding of science is not fixed, and I'm not sure that any of us in this room alone can fix this problem, but having this dialogue, raising consciousness, and thinking deeply about new ideas is extremely important. I take this as one sign of that, and I've seen multiple other signs. I see them at my institution. I see students and postdocs becoming engaged and empowered to try to change things. Is change hard? It is definitely extremely hard. Is there resistance to change? Tremendous resistance to change. particularly academic institutions, they're just not cauldrons of change. They are very set in their ways. But the dialogue is incredibly important. There are lots of negatives out there. You've heard about many of them this morning. There are huge financial pressures on institutions, and actually on the faculty and on all of you, whether you're a student or a postdoc. These are real. There's also a perception that is beginning to change, but perhaps more glacially than we would like, of considering what is an appropriate career for each of you after you complete your training. Those are personal decisions that every individual makes, and each of you need to take charge of those decisions as much as you possibly can. You need to think about and advocate for the kind of training you need and challenge people to think about training models that will help all of you succeed in careers. I can think of one in particular, an NIH-funded program that is funded by the ERACTA initiative. At the moment, I don't remember what that set of initials stands for, but it's a research training program that actually provides career development, particularly in teaching for postdoctoral trainees. Our experience with these programs nationally and also locally is that the trainees in this program, although they spend 25% of their time doing career development activities and activities related to the future career that they're preparing for, which might be an academic career, but not an academic research-intensive career, or it could be that, are as productive as postdocs who don't have these advantages in terms of publications. They do extremely well in finding positions. I think this is an outstanding model for other areas where postdocs or students could still receive rich training but have deep career exploration and preparation. This is something that we need to think about. We need to think about how exiting from training, whether it's an early exit from PhD training at the master's level, an earlier exit from postdoctoral training to pursue some career that does not involve bench research, how those exits can be facilitated, supported, and most importantly, looked at as, in many cases, positive career decisions as opposed to default decisions or failures. I could certainly continue on and discuss more challenges, more reasons for optimism, but I think I've given you a flavor of the way I approach this. And I hope as you leave today, you'll certainly still know that we have serious situations that we need to address. But I hope somewhere in each of you there will be a spark or a glimmer that will help you work to set us on a much more positive course in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rosenberg. Our fourth panelist is Dr. Cynthia Furhmann, who recently became the Assistant Dean of Career and Professional Development at the Graduate School of Biomedical Sciences at the University of Massachusetts Medical School. Dr. Furhmann got her PhD at the University of California, San Francisco, where after completion and a brief postdoctoral training, she transitioned into a position where she founded Preparing Future Faculty program at the University at UCSF and oversaw the development and professional skills program and resources for biomedical sciences. Dr. Furhmann is the co-author and developer of My IDP, an interactive career planning website that launched in 2012. Today, Dr. Furhmann will speak about aligning graduate and postdoctoral training with the needs of the biomedical workforce.
Hello. I am extremely honored to be here today on this panel, and I really wanted to make sure to carve out the time to be here today because I think it's fantastic that a group of postdocs have pulled this together and are thinking about these really big picture important issues that span our biomedical enterprise and scientific enterprise. I am not too distant in age from many of you, right? And I was able to launch into my career earlier by doing a very minuscule postdoc, right? Largely a name only, perhaps. So I've been on the ground and thinking about these big picture ideas and issues for a while now, and have really benefited from having mentorship from key thought leaders at the national level. And so I, too, want to share with you from our generation, right, a view of optimism, that we face tremendous issues right now and challenges. I have seen small steps taken at the national level that are having impact, and being on the ground myself, focusing on the career development of graduate students and postdocs, I'm seeing the impact of that. We're also seeing increased dialogue around these issues amongst faculty as well as students and postdocs, which I think benefits all of us and gives reason for optimism. We've heard, I'm going to move forward in the context of this. We've heard about these broad issues, right, that students and postdocs are facing. It's common for you to go on to many different types of careers in science, and perhaps closely related to science, and perhaps carving out your own careers as well. It's valuable to have PhDs in all these careers, it's been pointed out. That's absolutely true, I believe. And it's also true, though, that all of these different career paths are actually highly competitive. Because of these numbers that Michael Teitelbaum showed us, right, there are so many PhDs and scientists being trained now at this level that everything is competitive. There's no longer any fallback options. You need to have, and it's critical to have, backup options in place that you are preparing for at equal intensity, I would say, to your top choice careers. That message, I think, has not quite made it to trainees, and that's the focus of what I want to get across in the training initiatives that I'm working on. So I really think that graduate training overall, nationally, is not addressing these realities. We still have our heads in the sand and use language and actions in day-to-day mentoring and interactions that continue the perception that scientists being trained at the graduate postdoctoral level will more than likely go on to academic research, which is clearly not necessarily true anymore. So what do we do about that? So one of the topics for this was, how do we make policy changes or make other change to improve the training of graduate students and postdocs? So I thought that I would share with you, since these topics have been covered so well already, share with you an idea that we are trying. It's an experiment, right, on the ground to take some change and be focused on a solution, right? Try a solution, test it, and see what impact it has. So just briefly, right, when we think about training and preparing graduate students and postdocs for future careers, we need to recognize that the research progress is going to be a very important determinant of success in early stages and perhaps later stages as well, right? You're training to become scientists, and anyone knows that if you're hiring a PhD, they're looking to see that you're successful in that endeavor, right, or in your postdoctoral endeavor. But it's also really critical, and in some cases, once you get past that hurdle, maybe more critical to have really strong communication skills, be able to work on teams, contribute to projects in broad ways, right? And all these different professional skills that we may or may not deliberately focus on in our training. And then finally, there's this career preparation, right? So thinking about what your long-term goals might be, where do you want to potentially go, and because these careers are all very competitive, it might increase your chances and decrease risk by focusing your efforts to strategically prepare for 1 and even 2 career paths, and maybe a few more, right? And thinking about what specific skills or experience you need to launch into your first job, and what kind of network you're going to need, and mentoring along the way. I think these actions are taken often by students and perhaps postdocs, right, when you're getting ready to finish up. So what do we need more of? We need more awareness of these career trends that you all are now or already were highly aware of, right? But many students and postdocs aren't necessarily. We need our students and postdocs to have the skills to navigate all of this, to understand what the career options are, think creatively about creating their own new career paths, and evaluate those for themselves to find the right fit. We need to offer opportunities, help them find efficient ways to find opportunities to build the skills and experience and network they need, right? So that they can continue to work hard in the lab and get all that done. And that might mean that we could help encourage them to get mentorship from scientists outside of the academy if that's where they want to end up in the end. I think a key thing is awareness that early action is required. When a graduate student, for example, is getting ready, they say, oh, well, in a year I might graduate. Well, that's a critical time when you're wrapping up papers, writing your thesis, getting a lot of things in order. Not the best time to start trying to build a network, right? All these types of things can take some time. And that is really too late. And I see a lot of students discovering that and then having to find ways to transition themselves more slowly into a career. So what are the resources available, right? There are resources available, and I think that's important to keep in mind as we discuss these issues at a policy level, right? There are career centers, there are professionals who know a great deal about career development, and some of them who are pretty specialized in the PhD career development realm, right? But there's also setbacks. A lot of these professionals are not specialized, and they're focused on undergraduate education or don't have the training. And faculty mentors are doing a lot of institutions, but they don't know about the wide realm of careers, and I'm not sure that they need to, right, or that they should have to do that. At the national level, I've tried to, I've joined an effort to create some resources that are more openly accessible to everyone to help students and postdocs navigate this. And professional societies are doing something, but we need more, right? So what can we do locally? We are trying an educational experiment at UMass Medical School, and I have to say that this would not be possible without funding at a national level, right? So the NIH, out of the Biomedical Workforce Report, one of the concrete things that came out of that was the creation of awards called BEST Awards. This stands for Broadening Experiences in Scientific Training. These are pretty big awards, so in total, counting indirects, I was able to bring in, through our BEST Award, $2 million, right, across a 5-year period. That catches the eyes of university policymakers and opens the doors for trying new things, right? And that money provides funding to do research, which is so critical, to really evaluate whether what we're trying is working, right? What are the outcomes? Are they positive? And are there any negative unintended consequences that we could not have foreseen, but we do now that we're trying something new and different? So we're in the midst of this. What are we trying? Well, I thought I would try something new, right? Students and postdocs, some of them take action on their own and are aware of this and are moving forward. Others find out later that this might have been important to do earlier on. So we're trying to require training. Instead of offering workshops that people can attend, we're requiring key elements that we think are critical at critical times. We are treating all careers equally, so including academic careers, which was not necessarily part of the mandate of the BEST Award. It's almost the opposite. But we are treating them equally. And it's amazing how when you talk about careers more equally, you get a lot of pushback about talking about alternative careers, right? So we're not used to thinking about careers equally in this way. We're teaching in context, so we're trying to find ways to teach at times where students want to learn certain professional skills, and at times when students and postdocs are ready to think about these things. And we're emphasizing not only thinking ahead to your career path that you want to pursue, but a backup plan. So having all students, requiring them to write down 2 career paths that they're pursuing and what they're going to do to take action on that. So this is kind of a schematic describing our proposed plan that we've begun launching now this year. So we're layering on top of, this bottom layer represents kind of standard scientific curriculum for graduate students at the graduate student level, and I'll show postdoc interventions in the next slide. The idea is to teach these professional skills in short strokes through workshops, mini-series, kind of mini-courses similar to the Harvard Nano course approach in some cases, through a co-curriculum that all students are required to take starting in their first year. The first lesson of this actually addresses the fact that all careers are competitive and that students should feel open to think about any types of careers they're interested in, so a very early intervention. In the third year of this co-curriculum is a mini course focused on career planning and how to go about doing that, and they create their first individual development plan for the coming year. They do individual development plans annually, and this is now required and will be tracked through the graduate school. And then they will join 2 learning communities based on their career interests. So students will be required to participate in 2 or 3 meetings, at least 2 meetings per year for each of the careers that they're interested in. And these are relatively small groups of students across multiple years who are gathered around a particular career that they're interested in, and is facilitated by a career mentor who's a scientist currently employed in that career path. So we're trying to connect students with career mentors, and if the only thing that students are doing are these few workshops, this career planning course, these creating their own plans, and then having discussions about it a couple times a year, I think that could have some impact, and we'll have to see. Interestingly, it's not that much time, but I know that, and we've already seen some pushback because some of these elements are required. So it's different from what we're used to. For postdocs, we recognize that having requirements for postdocs at all is a novel idea and difficult to do because they are basically, unfortunately, treated as employees, right? Paid off of research grants typically. So what we are doing, though, is requiring a 2-hour lesson on career planning and creating an IDP in the first 3 months of getting their postdoctoral appointment. And then the other things are open to postdocs and encouraged for participation. So what can you do as postdocs, and maybe some of you are graduate students now, right? Early career scientists. I would suggest that you can start to create change in culture and develop a culture that's more open to thinking about these things by talking more openly about your careers. And that can feel risky, and it may be, and some of you may not want to do that. But the more that people do this and have this dialogue openly with faculty as well as peers, that's going to make a lot of change, right? As you move forward on your career and change directions in your career path, which many scientists do, reach out to your faculty and former mentors and tell them about that, right? So that they can see examples of trainees that they have brought through the system that are going on to do lots of different things. Collect and show data. So I had a wonderful experience of publishing a paper in the open access journal CBE Life Sciences Education, and it was an essay. So I was able to share some of my own thoughts and our thoughts as co-authors around these issues and what we might start to do nationally. That was bolstered by doing a survey of graduate students and their career interests. That's something you can do at your institutions. If this group, for example, were to survey all the postdocs in the Boston area and try to achieve a high response rate, wouldn't it potentially be eye-opening to people who might say, this is not happening at our institution? So use your voice and make sure you use it in venues where you're targeting the audience you want to reach, right? And appreciate the complexities. I think that's a great value of a symposium like this, at how complex all these issues are. And as was brought up, making significant urgent changes can then have some repercussions that we might not understand when we first consider them. So recognize that, and I think moving forward, you'll be even more successful as you engage in these discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Furhmann. So with that, we're going to open questions. You can stand at the mic if you're ready, but a few notes to keep this running, because we are limited on time, is try to make your questions a question and make them poignant. This is not an opportunity for a diatribe. We'll have an opportunity in the workshops to talk about your ideas and how to change some of these solutions. But with that, thank you. Go ahead.
I have a comment about the trade-off between quality and quantity. And then based on that comment, I want to make a very concrete suggestion and get your feedback about it. And I certainly share very much Marc's concern about unintended consequences. There are a lot of these, so it's dangerous to make concrete suggestions, but I think we should try. So in terms of quality versus quantity, it is very hard, genuinely hard, to evaluate the quality of scientific research when it happens. And the more research we produce, the harder it becomes. So what can we do, and is there anything to be done? One particular aspect that I think is very actionable is that while the NIH budget has been declining, it has also been distributed increasingly unequally between investigators. If you look at data from NIH, the top 10–20% best funded PIs have consistently received larger number of grants per PI. And part of what's happening, I think, is that people are trying to define greatness in career success by producing more, not by producing necessarily higher quality. Instead of appreciating what is conceptually new and significant, people try to build their careers and publish more by obtaining more funding. So one particular concrete suggestion that I have is that we make it exceedingly hard for PIs to obtain more than a certain number of grants or more than a certain amount of money. And then we put the pressure on excelling at the level of conceptual greatness, not at the level of sequencing more genomes and running a larger lab. And I think this is going to take care of a lot of the issues. If people have less money, they're going to have fewer trainees. They're going to have more time to train them. These fewer trainees are going to need fewer jobs. PIs are going to have time to be engaged in the science in a productive way. Essentially, it's going to take care of a lot of the issues, not all of them, but it also seems like a very actionable thing, essentially encouraging principal investigators to be principal investigators and not principal administrators. So to formulate my question is, can you think of unintended adverse consequences of instituting measures that limit the amount of funding that any particular PI can obtain?
Well, first of all, the NIH has an informal policy, or a policy, I should say, of having a threshold in the amount of money that the grants then have to come back to council for them to consider them a second time. In other words, they have to be aware of that issue. The threshold is about $1 million for most institutes, about $750,000 for the general medical sciences. The experience has been that most of those, it's rather seldom that people are in fact stopped, but it happens each round. And we may ask ourselves why that is the case. It's hard to know. But one possibility is that the investigators are deemed to be really outstanding and it's justified. You could have a more cynical view, but that shows an interest on the part of NIH to look at that issue specifically. The other question which I've asked Harold Varmus a lot, because he's the director of the National Cancer Institute, which is the largest institute at NIH, is how much these very, very largely, heavily funded investigators, what kind of an impact do they have on the overall funding, you know, I mean, and he insists it's relatively small. So that is the counter-argument. I haven't looked at the figures myself. I've always thought that it's a reasonable thing to raise. I think labs that have gotten very large, some of them are, as you point out, really administrative entities rather than scientific entities. I think there's much more attention should be paid in the direction you point to. And we certainly advocated that in our proposal. But, you know, yeah. So it must be more than 20% of the NIH spending. Right, right. And of course there are special cases of, you know, of some research is much more expensive to perform than others. But I agree. I think that this needs to be looked at. I think it's something we have to really understand productivity in a different way, which is if productivity is measured by the number of pieces of data or things that are produced per laboratory, then it does tend to increase with the number of people. But if you measure specific productivity, that is divided by the concentration or the number of people, that to me should be a criterion that is used, because that may in fact decrease with the number after a certain point.
I have some friends outside academia who are professionals, and they find it very surprising that the only person in a lab who has a permanent job is the PI. And then I tell them what all the other people do, and they say, well, they train and then they move on. Then they ask the question, where do they go? And I tell them the expectation is that they'd open their own lab, and they say very quickly, that doesn't seem to make lots of sense, because unless you have one postdoc for your entire life or career, you're going to continually expand things, the number of proposals are going to go up, it doesn't seem very sustainable. What about the idea of actually having a lab with more permanent staff in it than just the PI? This would allow the lab as a whole to write fewer grants, because you don't need a grant for every person that's there. And it would also allow people to commit to long-term goals in research, which, as you pointed out, that's really what people in science should do. They shouldn't be on a treadmill trying to publish high-impact papers every year. They may need to wait 5 or 10 years. And if that weight is absorbed across a lab where everyone has secure employment, maybe that would work better.
That was one of the really serious proposals in our paper, was to have more staff scientists, people who were well paid, not permanent in a sense that have tenure, but have some sort of commitment from the institution, at least for some period of time. And I think it would do just what you say, that it would provide more jobs for people. And I have to say, there are many young scientists and older scientists who feel that would be a very attractive career. If it was a reasonably paid career and they could do science, there are many people frustrated by the position of a principal investigator these days, where you spend so much of your time dealing with non-scientific issues. So yeah, I think it's, I'm not sure it's a panacea, but I think it should be looked at carefully, and I recommend you look at it in our PNS paper, because we do actually discuss that issue.
Okay. A question from Twitter. The NIH and institutions are both critically important in defining the structure of the system. So which of these two, either the NIH or individual institutions, is more productive to work on change with?
Are you looking at me? I can give you my opinion. I think we've heard some interesting opinions actually last night and today around this issue, right? I do agree that change needs to come, right, from the people who are doing it. And so the people on the ground at the institutions need to play a major role. And they have a lot of influence over NIH, I'm learning, right? But I have to say that when you say to someone, this is funded by the NIH, they think it's important, right? It makes faculty turn their heads and say, huh. And then they have to really, if they were thinking something different, they have to challenge that mode of thinking and think, why does the NIH care about this, and why are they saying this to us? I have to say another thing that came out of the biomedical workforce report was that the requirement that all PIs report on their progress reports for any grant mechanism, whether or not their trainees are creating individual development plans and how they're using them. It's really interesting. It's like a required encouragement of individual development plans. But I have to say, the NIH says something, faculty turn around and say, well, it sounds like we have to do this, and then they do it. So I do think, I think change at the national level can be really critical.
Thank you.
I wanted to add just one brief thing to that. I think you need both, because everything that occurs on the national level doesn't lead to change. I think one thing that Shirley Tillman and Sally Rockey charged the workforce with was to write a report that they could take forward that would have actionable items in it, as opposed to a report that would sit on a shelf. And I think you see some results of that. But I think change also happens locally that can impact individuals quite fast as well.
I would just quickly agree about that. The IDP requirement could easily become a piece of paper that everyone just fills out because they have to and just sets it aside and have no educational impact. And I think we're working really hard on the ground to make sure that it's meaningful and that the students and postdocs really get something out of it.
Yeah, I want to say something. I think the perspective of the NIH and institutions is quite different. And justifiably, and I think we have to remember what, as we raise the issues, what to say to each of those institutions. The NIH, in principle, doesn't care about the happiness and welfare of individual scientists. I say in principle because they're all made up of people who do care. I mean, the purpose really is what is going to really cure disease and make the country more healthy. And the policies derive from that issue. And much of what I've been concerned about in the present system, much as I care about the students and postdocs as human beings, is the feeling that the system is now becoming less productive, less effective, and will will not suit the goals that we as a country have, not we as scientists have. So I think we really have to couch our arguments in those terms. And I think the NIH's policies, we should expect them to be primarily driven by those concerns. Institutions have somewhat different concerns. They really want to maintain their relative stature. They want to maintain economic stability. They may have personal relationships with the faculty and want to consider them as human beings. So their interest in the overall health and welfare of the country is rather indirect. And so I think you just have to see those two entities as not necessarily sharing the same primary goals, although certainly they share them at some level.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Kelly, and I'm a postdoc, and I actually love being a postdoc. So I think maybe I'm one of the first people who've actually said that out loud. So I have a question and a suggestion that I think feeds really well into what we were just saying. Kind of thinking about this whole boom and bust cycle, and if we put more money into the system, it sounds like we're just going to continue these problems, and even if we wanted to put more money in the system, it doesn't sound like the money's there. So what if on the NIH side, we just drastically change how the money that's there can be spent? What if we, gradually over time insist that certain types of salaries can no longer be paid from NIH funds, such as like the PIs and the trainees, push that back onto the universities, make them actually pay their faculty's salaries, and also could we over time cut back on the indirect costs associated with grant money. That way the universities and the research institutes have to become more responsible for and invest in their staff and faculty, and the NIH, with their goals of actually doing research and curing disease, we can spend that money on the actual research projects. And if you think that might be one feasible approach, and if so, what would the fallout that I haven't thought of be?
That's a good example of why other speakers have said any change has to be incremental and slow, because the current system that's evolved, this is a kind of institutional evolution process that took place over the last 40, 50 years, is structured in the current incarnation as heavily dependent on external funding for some institutions for faculty salaries. In fact, some institutions incentivize or encourage their faculty members to increase the percentage of their salary that they gain from external research funding. It's probably most extreme in medical schools. So if you look at NIH as compared to NSF, both science funders, basic science funders, the medical schools are mostly under NIH funding, and it looks very different in medical schools. If you look at AAMC reports, for example, I recommend them to you. They've done surveys on what fraction of their member medical schools guarantee salary for their tenured faculty. And surprisingly, it's not very many anymore. It used to be a lot more. But what's happened is over time, they've evolved in such a way that while you may get a tenure letter, it doesn't guarantee you a salary. Or if it guarantees you a salary, it's a much lower salary than you're actually earning, supposedly, but you have to raise a substantial fraction. Under those conditions, and it would include arts and science faculties too, any dramatic change of the kind you're suggesting would be very destabilizing for the universities that have evolved into this heavy dependence for their core expenses, if you will, their faculty expenses on external research funding. So it would have to be done gradually. And in fact, Bruce Alberts, one of the quartet, has proposed that an incremental change that would put a corset or a cap gradually down to 50%, but can't do it overnight because it would cause these disruptions. In the meantime, NSF, those of you who are in those domains of basic science, they have never allowed more than 2 months of salary to be paid under an NSF research grant. The result is that the system, even though it's not as heavily funded, is actually somewhat more stable in the NSF ecosystem than it is in the NIH ecosystem.
I want to just add one thing to that, and I actually agree with these comments. The situation is particularly problematic, I guess I would say, in medical schools, and clearly it does have to be contained, but universities derive their income, some at certain universities some from the state, but a major driver of income, non-research income at universities, is tuition. And tuitions, no matter at what level, are rising dramatically and outstripping the ability of many individuals to fund that cost. Faculty salaries and other costs also come from those dollars. And so it's a very difficult situation. Many faculty whose predominant mission is to do research are actually being supported by, to some extent, although it may not be very much, by tuition dollars that students are paying that someone else is teaching. So it's a complicated situation, and one that seems very challenging for institutions to sort out.
Hi. I will pile on with the I like being a postdoc sentiment. So that's two of us. I would love to hear the panel's predictions for the future character of the population of researchers. Like if you consider these previous booms and busts as like bottleneck events that sort of change the shape of who's left afterwards. You know, when the dust settles, there will be some survivors, presumably, and they get to reproduce via trainees and impart their sort of philosophy and outlook on research. So, you know, based on the past and also what you guys predict for the future, like what will research look like? Like what was Los Alamos like after the Manhattan Project, or NASA after the lunar landing? Like, are the best and the brightest really left? Is it a competition of the fittest, or is it something a little more ruthless? And what will we look like? What will our population look like in just a few years?
Well, I don't know, is the short answer. I'm a demographer, and demographers do projections, and the worst thing you could do with a long-term projection, however sensibly you do it, and correctly you do it, is to believe it to be a forecast. A almost universal mistake made by journalists when they see demographic projections is to use verbs like there will be X, or it should be there would be. There would be if the assumptions of the projection turn out to be correct. And that's the challenge. What assumptions should you build into the projection? We can see a few trends underway, I think, that might give a little hint, but I'm not forecasting anything. We do see more women, rising numbers of women in biomedical sciences doing PhDs, although going into postdocs, there seems to be less high probability for them than for men. Declines in broadly science and engineering fields, declines in the historically largest demographic group, which is white males, is declining gradually. Rising numbers of international students who then adjust status and become permanent residents who stay, and rising numbers of Asian Americans. Some slight increase in other more underrepresented minority groups, but Asian Americans are an overrepresented minority group in these fields. So if those kinds of trends were to continue for 30 years, you might see some changes in the appearance, if you will. But the best and the brightest, your point, I don't think we have any way. I mean, the best and the brightest could be people who are absolutely committed to becoming a scientist or a mathematician. That's all they want to do. They love it. It's a calling for them. It's like going into the priesthood or becoming a modern dancer. That's what they want to do, knowing what the challenges are. Those people may be the best and brightest in many respects, but there are also people who are very bright, maybe best and bright, who at the margin may not be so committed to this calling, and they may have a lot of other options that look more attractive to them, and they may be some of the people who are filtered out of the system. But I'll start over again. I don't know.
I think we if Michael doesn't know, I certainly don't know. I should sit there. But we could ask about what sorts of things we might do and what might happen to help ensure a better outcome. And so the first thing I think is the amount of money that the NIH is going into the NIH. And the question is, how would you evaluate that amount of money? I mean, certainly but in terms of the cost of medical care and the interest of the American people in health, and if you ask people how much they want, if you ask people how much should be spent on medical research, in a few polls that have been done, it's much higher than you would have predicted. You know, $1 out of $10 should be spent on medical research or spent on health. So the question of how much we should spend is clearly an issue that I think could be debated, and this country has always had a very favorable outlook on it. Some of the pressures that are being felt on the NIH budget, one should understand, are not directed at the NIH budget per se. They're really collateral damage from sequesters and all sorts of things. It's not that the American people have fallen out of love with medical research, and quite the contrary. So there is a possibility, and I think we should all work for explaining the value of what we're doing, and there's certainly plenty of advances that are coming. There's certainly enough diseases around that new ones that we have to worry about, not to mention old ones that haven't been cured. So there's one side of the story. The other side of the story, I think, is that science itself is changing. And we might want to think about how to make that work to our advantage. I mean, when I walk into the lab today, I feel like nobody's working. because I see them sitting at their desks using computers. When I was a student, I was running columns, and things were whirring and buzzing, and things were shaking, and noise was being made, and it's really I have to adjust myself to that. But that actually speaks to the fact that a lot of research is not being done in the lab anymore, and there are more, facilities which also train PhDs at a very high, track PhDs at a very high level, whether it's sequencing or whether it's flow cytometry or mass spectrometry or whatever the methodologies are. So maybe the future lab isn't quite so large as it was, and maybe it's more, if we were more cooperative, we wouldn't have to maintain one person in every lab who knew every technique. We could have some sort of economy of the scale of the whole enterprise as well. The other thing, which is a statistic I've never really collected except informally, because I'm not a demographer, but in any case, is something I would like to plot is the time since last experiment versus the time after one gets to be a PI. And it seems that certainly I was doing experiments a decade after I was a PI, and not at the full strength, but certainly in the first few years at nearly full strength. And there have always been a few people who really want to stay in the lab, but they're always forced to have small labs. And maybe that kind of model, particularly with a lot of support from other kinds of facilities that will enable these people to do these things, can gradually, or maybe not so gradually, move forward, and we can have more people actively engaged in the scientific process. Let's go. So as we try to imagine the future, rather than try to predict it, because who would have predicted that the United States would be the largest oil producer in the world at this era? It's like anything. It's just depends on so many other things. We should be thinking about raising money for NIH funding. We should also be thinking about how the structure of our own enterprise would become more efficient, more productive, more satisfying, and less unstable.
I'd like to add just real quickly to the thoughts that Michael was sharing around best and brightest, and that is something that some of us might forget, and that is that the group of best and brightest that we want some of those people certainly coming into science to enrich our scientific enterprise and strengthen it, right? Amongst those that, if all the outcomes if science is looked at as less attractive, then we could lose some of those best and brightest, and it could be some of the people who are less committed, but it also could be some people who are very committed, but who have external pressures that make it difficult for them to stay in science. And people who are first generation coming into science and aren't used to the culture, and figuring out the culture of science is challenging enough it pushes them out, right? Or people who financially can't continue because of other reasons. And that means that we are going to lose a biased group of people, right, who would have brought in richer perspectives to diversify the perspectives in science. And I think that's one issue that we need to be aware of.
Thanks. I just have one comment. We're going to go for a few more minutes before we have lunch, so you have time to ask questions. But something I forgot to mention is we are videotaping and audio taping, and so if you have an issue with that, it is going to be if you're asking questions, you're going to be part of that, just so you know.
So I think this actually might touch on what Cynthia just said. But going back to what Marc brought up about how there's this current obsession in America with the free market and everything is most efficient according to free markets, but how that might not really be cultivating creativity in science, would it be crazy to sort of turn around those market forces and use those to sort of manipulate the system to stabilize it? I.e., would it be crazy to have the NIH force everyone to pay students and postdocs a lot more in an effort to reduce numbers in that way? And would that totally destroy the system? And sort of the second half of that is, could you sort of go in an effort to peel behind the veil of indirect costs, which the NSF has done a much better job of controlling than the NIH, would it be absolutely nuts to completely remove the line item for amortization and depreciation of facilities and replace it with outright grants for construction and renovation.
I think that has to be for you.
I think, again, there was a recommendation in our proposal to raise there are several reasons to raise the funding for postdocs, particularly they're older and longer time, spend longer time in training, but also with better funded postdocs, there are going to be fewer of them. I mean, that's your point, and that was part of the point there too. There was another point why we thought that if we have staff scientists, we should not make the postdocs so cheap that everybody will find a way to use them as as cheap labor, and that was another reason for wanting to raise it at a higher level. So I think yes, we can, but that is a form of constraint on the system. But I think that was something we thought was reasonable to propose.
On the amortization and depreciation point in the indirect costs, if you really want to go to sleep, you should read OMB Circular A21, in which all of these things are laid out in wonderful bureaucraties. But they have some unanticipated effects. I'm not sure it's on amortization and depreciation. After all, labs do depreciate, equipment depreciates, new equipment has to be purchased. So it's a good idea, actually, for universities to build in amortization and depreciation. Some universities, one in particular I won't name that I was affiliated with, didn't do that in its budget, and the result was that its facilities deteriorated rather than where they weren't maintained even because there was no money for maintenance. And then they would go to the alumni on a capital campaign to redo the buildings after the leaks in the roof got too bad. That's not a good way to go about things. But one of the puzzling things in Circular A21 is the way interest is handled. So if you borrow money, you're a university, you're Tufts University, you borrow money through a bond issue for the state or a mortgage and you build a new laboratory, the mortgage or debt payments are factored into your indirect costs. If you own the building, there is an implicit cost, but you own it, so you're not paying interest. You can't include the implied interest of the owned building. I'm not sure I understand that in economic terms, but you can see how it would provide institutions with incentives to borrow money to build new buildings or remodel existing buildings and let the indirect costs from research grants defray the cost of that. I'm not sure you want to have that kind of incentive. You have that situation. I'm sure you see it much more clearly than I do.
Actually, I tend to agree with you on this point. I think this is something that has contributed greatly to some of the kinds of problems that we have, particularly problems related to biomedical research that goes on in medical schools or medical schools and their affiliated academic medical centers. So I think that's a huge problem, and it should be addressed. But again, I feel like it needs to be addressed gradually because you don't want the system, I think, to collapse completely. So it would have to be an incremental change.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Amanda. I'm a postdoc. So I actually Googled soft money because I didn't know what it was. And soft money. Basically, Google said it's a polite euphemism for funding that comes from a source outside a university or research institute and must be pursued regularly and with vigor. Okay, I get that. So what I don't understand is, does there exist hard money, and should that hard money be from the institution? Do you think that the institution needs to take more responsibility in funding this hard money? And the other thing I wanted to say is, I owe a lot of money in loans from undergrad, so I'm essentially paying back, I will be paying back for a very long time these loans, and I think tuition at BU is between like $45,000, $50,000. I want to know where this money is going, if it's being used appropriately, and if maybe we could appropriate some of it to research and salaries.
Well, hard money used to be the budget of the institution, coming from endowment, tuition, and other sources of revenue. And soft money was a relatively small fraction 50 years ago, coming in the form of grants for particular projects. But as you've been hearing, the proportionalities have shifted, and some institutions have become quite dependent on the external research funding. But the point that has been made by several people here is that these institutions are complex systems in and of their own right. Then they're part of a much larger national and international complex system. So if they receive less money from soft money, they will have to find the money to replace the soft money because let's say it's going down or is limited in some way. They'll have to find it from somewhere, or they'll have to reduce expenditures. Now, otherwise, they can't print money. They're not the Federal Reserve Board. They can't just print more money. So where would it come from? Could come from tuition. That's what's been happening as the state governments have reduced their contributions to public institutions. Then they've raised tuition, which was kept low by the state contribution. So when you poke on this system in one part of it, it'll bulge out or change in some way its shape at some other point. And one of the real challenges of universities, in my experience with all the universities I've been associated with, is how do you restrain the growth of expenditures? That's much harder than it is in a corporation, say, because in the corporation, the board of directors and the CEO have line authority over expenditures, but in a university, the authority is much more diffused. Anyway, the general point is less soft money will mean the hard money will have to come from somewhere, and you can nominate your source for the hard money.
Well, I think it's good to, if you go back to read the Vannevar Bush Endless Frontier, I mean, he makes a very good argument, but I think it also shows some of the weakness in the present situation. I mean, this was 1945. He was worried about vast unemployment. He was also wanted to build a culture in America of science. He was arguing for a huge investment of the federal government. He also argued that the universities were in no position themselves to invest in this money, to create this infrastructure. And he also was kind of dismissive of industry, of doing the right kind of thing. I mean, he wasn't counting on them for that investment. So we built a system to increase the scale as quickly as possible of this research enterprise. And of course, that was 1945, and then but we had lots of other reasons to increase the scale, some of which are still valid today, and that is the importance of medical research or scientific research more broadly for the economy, which is something Vannevar Bush emphasized, for the health of this country. I mean, in the response that to the original letter, or the letter, not the response, but the letter that was written to Bush to ask him to come to create this report by FDR in the fall of 1944. I mean, he pointed out that more people died of disease than during the fighting of the World War II for Americans than died of being shot and killed, and so there was a lot of good reasons for doing all that. So the incentives were really built in. We have incentives, as Michael says, for putting more salaries on grants. Not only do they get the salaries paid, but they get indirect cost on the salaries paid. So it's pretty big incentive. And I do feel that even if the total amount of money going into universities may be reasonable at this point. There are incentives in the way the money is structured, which really should be reconsidered if we don't want to grow at quite that same rate. Now, if we do, which is a political decision, then maybe things are okay.
All right, with that, we're going to unfortunately have to end questions, but you'll have an opportunity to hopefully speak with the panelists during lunch. But first, Kristen's going to give you a little, before anybody gets up and moves and heads to lunch, which is just right outside, Kristen's going to give you a little information about this afternoon's program.
Oh, please. Oh, yes, let's actually thank the speakers again before.